In your U.S. history book now, we're in chapter 29, section 2, on the George H.W. Bush administration. Now, don't get that mixed up as we go through, because later on, his son would become president, and his name would be George W. Bush without the H. So I just call him, the senior and the junior Bush, right? President. So here are some pictures of his life. He had a history of being in the military, as you see here. Here's a picture with his wife, and on to that presidential election, 1989 to 1993 is when he was president. His picture here. And here's a picture when he went to China. In fact, and this is in Desert Storm, and we're going to be talking about Desert Storm. So let's begin. There. The election of 1988. So we've got all the way through history of U.S. history up to 1988 now. So Ronald Reagan's popularity with America helped his vice president, George H.W. Bush, to victory in the 1988 presidential election. He defeated Democratic candidate Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana became the new vice president, and President Bush promised to continue the wise policies of his predecessor, which was who? Ronald Reagan. So basically, as he went into the presidency, he basically said he was going to do the same things that Reagan had done, which were a lot of them very popular, especially with the United States people. And also a lot of it very wise. So anyway, we have George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis picture here. Here we have, you can see how all of these states, these red states here, these are all the states that Bush won in the Electoral College. So, and here we have, by the time George H.W. Bush was the Republican nominee for president, he had been ambassador to the UN, envoy to China, director of the CIA, and vice president. So not only was he vice president, but he also had a history, especially being involved in the United Nations and going to envoying to China before. So he was already involved in those things before. So not that I think that those things were very good things. The United Nations kind of got off track, but anyway, let's go on. The foreign policy, China, Tiananmen Square. When you think of Tiananmen Square, I always think, oh, how horrible. And indeed, it was horrible. Because prior to this time, we were thinking, China going into communism, and would China come through against communism? What was happening in China? So, and you can see in 1989, April of 1989, university students in China challenged the communist regime. So the students say, we went out of communism. Well, in Beijing, 1 million, can you imagine? 1 million students and workers gathered in Tiananmen Square in a great demonstration for freedom. With banners and a statue representing democracy, they expressed their desires for freedom to the world via television satellite. So they were being televised all over the world and what was going on in China for democracy. 1 million students protesting in Tiananmen Square. For over a month, the world watched and waited to see how the Chinese government would respond. So on June 4th, communist tanks and soldiers appeared in the streets of Beijing to crush the freedom demonstrators. So over 1,000 people were killed, and many of them were imprisoned. So they crushed the demonstration of 1 million people, 1 million mostly students, and many were put in prison. And so one of the saddest days in history, I would say, as for the communist government coming in and taking over China fully and demonstrating to them that communism would be the government in China. And sad day, and many being killed, and many being tortured, and many being put in prison. A terrible time. The United States responds or doesn't? Let's find out. So Congress passed an amendment to withhold the most favored nation trading status from China. So prior to this, China had a most favored nation trading. So we were trading with China like mad. Most favored nation right here, America and China. So for many years since Nixon, remember Nixon went there, the United States had granted the most favored nation status to China, extending certain privileges. So since Nixon, China had the most favored nation. So President Bush believed the best way to fight communism was through free trade, but he continued to grant China most favored nation status in spite of congressional opposition. So when you think of this, what should he do? He pretty much was compromising, right? The decision caused America to appear as if she were willing to overlook the communist tyranny. So here we have Bush, and we have down here the visit to China with his wife Barbara, and onto the China diary of George H.W. Bush. So he's dealing with China. Now, he already had gone to China, and he had thought, oh, we'll be friends with China. So he was trying to put forth a compromise in what he was going to do about this whole thing that happened at Tiananmen Square. So does he respond, or does he totally compromise? When I look back, I think he was more towards the compromising. Central America. In 1989, President Bush ordered American troops into Panama to capture the unpopular dictator Manuel Noriega. So here's a picture of Manuel Noriega. And he had killed several of our servicemen and had been smuggling illegal drugs into the United States. So the American forces captured Noriega and brought him to the United States for trial and sentenced him to jail, to be in jail. The people of Panama then elected a new leader. The financial inability to the former Soviet Union to support communist terrorism led to a more stability in Central America, especially Nicaragua and El Salvador. So when you think about Central America, you're thinking of these countries. You're thinking of Panama, you're thinking of Nicaragua, you're thinking of El Salvador for sure, because they were being supported by Russia, well, I should say the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was directing money to go to them to promote communism in their countries and unrest. But since, 1989, what happened? Ronald Reagan, his fight against communism and the Iron Curtain falling, the Soviet Union found itself in distress in that point and could not financially support, these countries in Central America. And so we found that because of that, that instability there, this led actually to a more stable Central America. Those seeking, now not the financial situation they had with communism, right? So here's, of course, Noriega. Look at him like, oh my goodness, not only killing servicemen, smuggling illegal drugs, being that communist type dictator in Panama, now though being captured. So Central America's looking up a bit, but still this turmoil would go on with the drug cartels and such, we know. South Africa and Mandela. So this, Mandela is a very controversial figure, even for me in my heart, because you think, oh, wow, he's a freedom fighter. He's fighting for civil rights, which indeed he was. So, and then you go on from that and think, no, but he's being supported. All of his backing has been by communism. So you think he's a socialist, communism, actually in the midst of this, fighting against apartheid, which is racial segregation. So we have two big issues here. So let's talk about this. So in 1990, the South African government released communist sympathizer Nelson Mandela. He lived 1918 to 2013. They released him from prison. He was in prison for basically causing uprisings in South Africa. Now, South Africa, you see, is very at the tip of Africa. I just didn't know where it is. So he had been held for attempts to subvert the government, to take over the government. So Mandela visited the United States after that, claiming to be a moderate socialist. But later on we find, yes, he was totally backed by Soviet Union and, communist Cuba. And you'll see him close friends with Fidel Castro, even pictures where they were buddied up, right? They were talking and smiling together and having dinner, so that kind of stuff. So the new media portrayed him as a hero and instead focused on apartheid, racial segregation in South Africa, overlooking the communist terrorist movement that Mandela had supported. So the United States and many other nations had imposed economic sanctions on South Africa to discourage apartheid. Finally, South Africa did abolish apartheid in 1994. Okay, let's go back. What is apartheid? Basically, like we had in the South, it was racial segregation. It was really being prejudiced against the Black Africans, right? And so it was actually pretty horrible because they were not allowed to go, to sit together. They'd be at the back of the bus and all that kind of stuff, but only worse in South Africa. So this was horrific. So Nelson Mandela did stand up against this, but his backing was communism. As he wanted to overthrow the government and do away with apartheid, he also wanted to bring in the communist regime. And so that's where the issue gets tricky, because America, of course, we did not want to, infringe on the civil rights, supporting apartheid in South Africa. No way, that is terrible. That would be terrible. So we had to stand against that. But we also needed to stand against the communist regime coming in and taking over, because you see, communism does that. It comes in and everything gets worse, and all the protests and everything, and horrific things happen, riots and everything else. And then communism comes in with a socialist communist leader and takes control and makes the whole country communist in nature, which we know what happens with that. Basically, the first thing they do is not allow Christian evangelism. They get rid of any Christian ties of religion in the country. And then from that point, they take over all of the businesses and such. We know what happens with communism. So we have two things happening here. So the thing is, basically they had made in America at this time, thinking, of course, he was standing for against, for civil rights, against apartheid. Yeah, yay, we're all happy. Yeah, he's a freedom fighter. But then we're like, oh dear, he's going to bring in something even possibly worse if he brings communism in. So a very controversial figure. Mandela even been in prison before and all. You think, okay, how does he think? Well, one thing we know, he's not really thinking totally righteously, is he? Lifting the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Wow. This is so big. Such a moment in history for such a time as this. I can say that I was involved in this later on as going in to the Soviet Union after it changed, and after it fell. back to Russia, going into Russia, and sharing the gospel. So in 1989, the communists lost control of Eastern Europe. Solidarity gained control in Poland in June. In Poland drops away from communism. Hungary declared her independence in October away from the communist regime. Czechoslovakia rose up against communists in November. And East Germany opened the Berlin Wall in November also. So millions of Berliners filled the streets to celebrate as young Germans destroyed sections of the wall with sledgehammers. Romania overthrew her communist dictatorship in December. In October 1990, East and West Germany now were reunited. Many Eastern European nations considered themselves now independent of the Soviet Union. But that has happened so quickly. So we have, 1989, the communists losing control of Eastern Europe and on to Poland. Poland solidarity gaining control in Poland. Poland coming away from communism. Hungary just 1 month later. And Czechoslovakia 1 month after that. And then now East Germany, totally. The East Germans now reunited with the West Germans. Can you imagine that? If you had a family that were in East Germany and you were in West Germany, you hadn't seen them for all those years because you were not allowed to, because they put a wall, because they didn't want communism out. How horrible and what infringements on their freedom. But now they can reunite, and East and West Germany, the Germans, basically they could actually, be one. It's a pretty amazing moment. Here's pictures of sledgehammer. Later on, we even have a picture later on of Ronald Reagan and Nancy going over there, and they're with sledgehammers too on the wall. After when Bush was president, after that. But here we have pictures. Here you can see, of the wall here. This is in Poland, solidarity in Poland. This is in Hungary, and this is in Romania, all coming free. They're not under the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain now has been lifted. Troop reductions in Europe now start. Whenever we say start strategic, I always think start, okay, it means strategic. What's strategic about it? Well, it means strategic arms reduction treaty. Start is to now, we need to reduce our arms, our nuclear weapons. We need to control our arms race, right? Is our weapon race, getting more advanced weapons. So the United States and Soviet Union had agreed to limit troops in Europe. So Russia soon withdrew troops from the Eastern European bloc, and the United States withdrew troops from Western Europe. So the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, was signed in 1991. The United States and the Soviet Union agreed to destroy some of their nuclear weapons. So here we have a fresh start, they call START. Here we have under Bush, he's signing a treaty of START to limit our weapons, to reduce our weapons, and also for the Soviet Union. Here we have Brezhnev here too, or Gorbachev. I'm sorry, that's Gorbachev. Sometimes I get mixed up in Gorbachev and Brezhnev, but here we have. I know Gorbachev has basically has the birthmark, the difference between them. And Brezhnev has the thick eyelashes, or eyebrows, I should say, and eyelashes. So that's how I remember. So that's a good way to remember, So Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic. In June of 1991, Boris Yeltsin, he lived 1931 to 2007. He was a reformer and became the president of the Russian Republic. Here's a picture of Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had resigned now from the Communist Party the year before. The hardline Communist Party members then became fearful of losing their grip on the Russian people and attempted a military coup against Soviet Premier Gorbachev in August. So we have a coup going on in the midst of, with Yeltsin and Gorbachev, we have this coup. We have the Soviet premier, Gorbachev is still premier, and then we have the president, Boris Yeltsin here. So here's Yeltsin, and in the midst we have Gorbachev, and they're coming through, and then we have a coup coming in. The Communist Party still wants control, and so we have all this going on. That being attacked here in Russia. Here's a picture with Yeltsin, and onto here, you know, the tanks coming out, and Yeltsin's dead. This whole thing was there was a lot of turmoil going on in Russia at this time. So you can see here's afterwards, they put flowers in the tank. They really wanted to stop the fighting. The Soviet Union's collapse, December 25th, 1991. So remember 1989, that was under Reagan, you know, to tear down that wall, you know, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. So anyway, now it's 1991. But now, in December 25th, on Christmas Day, our Christmas Day, the Soviet Union would totally collapse. So Western aid began to flow to the country to help the people defend themselves against a return to the hardline communism. Thinking, oh, now after it falls, is the communists going to take over again? So in December, Gorbachev resigned as the president on December 25th, 1991, which marked the collapse of the Soviet Union as a nation. So 12 of the former Soviet republics band together to form now the Commonwealth of Independent States. So we have major things going on in the Soviet Union, in Russia. Now that we're not going to be called the Soviet Union anymore, the USSR. We're now going to be called the Commonwealth of Independent States of Russia. So here we have pictures. We have here, it's announced, ABC is announced on December 25th, 1991. This is right in Red Square, you know, as the Soviets collapsed and now not being the USSR anymore, and the Communist Party not being able to take over in that sense. You know, so now we have, you know, here's a picture of the sinking boat, and we have, let's see, you know, all these countries, see all these countries here underneath, you know, Ukraine, Georgian, Lithuania, Estonia, you know, all of these, you know, from Latvia, you know, all of these, including the Eastern Europe, all these countries, small countries forming and getting off the boat of the USSR. So, and here we have a picture there of Russia, the whole communism. Here we have a picture of them tearing down statues, the statues of Lenin. You know, here they tore it down. Here's the head of it, and they're hitting the head of Lenin. Boy. And here again, you know, the tanks being there, and as the tanks are there, they end up putting flowers in the tanks here. So here is Gorbachev resigning, and on this day, when he resigned, December 25th, 1991, that would end the Soviet Union's communist regime, so-called. You know, so here's a picture of all the countries here. We have all these countries over here. You know, Ukraine, Belarus, all of these countries here that were influenced and under the Iron Curtain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, all of these were controlled by communism. Down here, you know, we have Georgia, and then we have these, like Kakistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all of these here control. Now, all the Russian Federation now is very small compared to what it was. It was huge. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. So in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein, he lived 1937 to 2006, was dictator of Iraq, and he invaded the tiny rich kingdom now of Kuwait. Why would he invade Kuwait? We'll find out in a bit. Oil, maybe? Oil-rich kingdom. Hussein threatened Europe and Japan's oil supply now because he was taking over Kuwait. That's where they got their major oil from this small country of Kuwait. Other Arab nations feared they would be next. Saddam, his plan was, okay, we'll take Kuwait, then we're going to go on to the rest of the Arab world. So Israeli secret agents discovered that Hussein was close to developing an atomic bomb. So Hussein was going to develop an atomic bomb. So this made us worried. You know, we have a dictator, a military dictator now of Iraq that's going to have an atomic bomb. What would he do? So President Bush convinced the United Nations to send troops to liberate Kuwait and protect the other Arab nations. So here we have August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. Here's pictures of invading Kuwait. Here's Saddam Hussein, military. He actually wanted, he believed he was the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar, and that he was going to take over the world, you know, and that he was going to rebuild Babylon. And Babylon is in Iraq, and that Iraq would be the center of the world, and he would be that so-called Antichrist leader. Operation Desert Storm, the Persian Gulf. As with the past dealings with the United Nations, the United States provided most of the military strength as the United Nations declared war. So in 1991, about 500,000 American troops, including Air Force and Navy units, had been sent to the Saudi Arabia Peninsula to liberate Kuwait. Congress supported the Operation Desert Storm. So this went really quick. So here, Bush signs Operation Desert Storm. Congress supports it. The United Nations gets involved, and the United Nations involved in this whole thing. The United Nations coalition forces began to round up clock bombing of Iraqi troop positions. So the United Nations, actually, United States really being, you know, the main military strength of that, coming in and clock bombing of the Iraqi troop positions. Smart bombs. They had smart bombs now, and cruise missiles, and the United States enabled the Air Force to select and destroy military targets with limited harm to civilian population. So now with smart bombs, they could be smart, and they could avoid civilians and hone in right into those areas of military, as they were military, should I say, camps, military camps of the enemy. So here we have smart bombs for the first time being used in Desert Storm. Military leadership now was under Colin Powell, General Colin Powell. Here's a picture of him here. Bush insisted the war in the Persian Gulf be directed by a military men, and not by politicians. Be directed by a military man. Politicians, of course, he looked back at Vietnam, and the politicians running the Vietnam War made it a no-win war. It was terrible. So now we have General Colin Powell. He lived 1937 to 2021, and he was put in command of Operation Desert Storm. Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee and second in command only to the president. So he became the spokesman for the military, explaining to the American people exactly what the UN forces were doing in the Middle East. And of course, the United States, being that strength for the UN. He insisted on taking the offense and pushing towards the total victory to liberate Kuwait. For the first time since World War II, Congress followed the counsel of a military commander. So here we have General Colin Powell, the head of the military, only second in staff at this point to the President of the United States. General Norman Schwarzkopf. He lived 1934 to 2012. General Schwarzkopf was appointed to lead the troops into battle. He inspired great devotion and bravery in his men. He kept the American public aware of the events of the war with daily broadcast television briefings beamed by satellite. Patriotism and national unity in America were extremely high, just like back in World War II, So here we have Schwarzkopf here, and he's right there with his men in charge, and they are all in one accord going forth to Desert Storm. Media limitations. General Powell and General Schwarzkopf recommended that the president set limits on the coverage of the media, not like it was in Vietnam. They remembered during the Vietnam War how reporters had exploited the violence and distorted the news for their own biases through the media, and they did not want that happening. Many Americans had been influenced by the liberal media. The president's decision to control the coverage was frustrated by the media, but it resulted in a much more of a political unity of spirit in the United States. So because they didn't present, every bloody issue of it, on TV and all these things, and then very, very much to their advantages now, that was not allowed. So here we have a much more unity in spirit in America on Operation Desert Storm. Here's some pictures here again. Of course, the media were not allowed in to take pictures and put them on television for their own biases. Invasion and victory. The Persian Gulf War lasts only 2.5 months. So a victory. 2.5 months. That's all it took. 2.5 months. And we had won. February 24th, 1991, American, British, and French forces, assisted by Saudi and Egyptian forces, invaded Iraq, while Israeli forces stood ready to assist at any point. So Iraq was being surrounded here. Not only that, for all the Arab countries and Israel. The Iraqi army crumbled under General Schwarzkopf's brilliant strategies. So thousands of Iraqi troops surrendered or fled. In a few days, Kuwait had been liberated. So Kuwait now was liberated. Saddam Hussein retreated into a hidden bunker in Baghdad. And Bush did not pursue him at all because the primary objective, he said, was liberating Kuwait, and that already had been achieved. Major mistake, to let Saddam Hussein go, major mistake. I have to say that because later on he would be back. The Persian Gulf lasted 2.5 months, making it the shortest war America has ever fought. A triumph for the American military and a cause for freedom. So here we have the invasion and victory of the Persian Gulf War, and it lasted only 2.5 months. So now we have, Iraq. You see his picture. Here's where, to know where this is. Here's Iraq. Here's Iran. Down to Saudi Arabia. Here's Kuwait, right in the midst of all this small. But look at, the oil comes from, 24% from Saudi Arabia, 13.3% from Kuwait. So Kuwait being one of the smallest countries here, but one of the countries that produces the most oil. So you can see how Iraq being, right next to Kuwait would want to take over Kuwait. And that's what Saddam Hussein was trying to do. Domestic affairs, a new Supreme Court justice. So Bush nominated federal judge Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court to replace Thurgood Marshall, who was retiring. Many liberals opposed Thomas's appointment because of his conservative views. But after much debate, the Senate confirmed his appointment to the Supreme Court. So now this is important because on the Supreme Court, they make final rulings on everything. And now we have a conservative judge that Bush appoints for the Supreme Court. Intelligent design, a new move. I'm going to stop there, and we're getting into another section here of domestic affairs. So I'm going to stop here because we're getting kind of long and I have to rush. So let's stop here and we'll go on with this in the next video.